The courtroom was dead silent as Judge Angela Cooper shuffled through the papers one final time. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the wooden rail in front of me just to stay upright. 3 months of fighting, 3 months of proving I belong somewhere, and it all came down to this moment. Wayne Chavez, the lawyer who had been trying to steal my inheritance, sat across the aisle with his smug smile finally starting to crack. I was 19 years old, standing in a Montana courthouse, fighting for a ranch I had never seen until 4 months ago, left to me by a grandfather I never knew existed. The judge looked up at me, her gray eyes serious but not unkind. This was it. Either I would walk out of here as the rightful owner of the Double Creek Ranch, or I would be back on the streets with nothing but the clothes on my back and a heart full of broken dreams. Everything I had learned about family, about belonging, about what it meant to have a home, hung in the balance of whatever words came out of her mouth next. But let me tell you how I got here, because this story does not start in a courtroom. It starts in a place where hope goes to die, where kids like me learn that family is just a word other people get to have. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. I want to hear from everyone who has ever felt like they did not belong anywhere, because this story is for you. The Riverside Youth Facility was not the worst place I had ever lived, but it was definitely not home. I had been there for 2 years, ever since I aged out of my last foster placement at 17. The walls were that institutional green that makes everything look sick, and the fluorescent lights hummed constantly like angry wasps. I shared a room with 3 other girls, and we all pretended we did not care that nobody wanted us anymore. I was folding laundry in the common room when Dorothy Brooks, the facility director, called my name. Dorothy was one of those women who had spent so many years working with broken kids that she had developed a shell as hard as concrete, but underneath it, you could sometimes catch glimpses of someone who actually cared. She was holding a manila envelope and wearing the kind of expression that meant either very good news or very bad news. I followed her into her cluttered office, past the motivational posters about perseverance and the filing cabinets stuffed with the stories of kids like me. She gestured for me to sit in the cracked leather chair across from her desk, the same chair where I had heard about every placement that had not worked out, every family that had decided I was not the right fit. Dorothy set the envelope on the desk between us and leaned back in her chair. She studied my face for a long moment, like she was trying to figure out how to deliver whatever news was inside that envelope. I had learned not to get my hopes up about anything, so I just sat there and waited. Finally, she spoke. My grandfather had died. A man named Jacob Nelson, who owned a ranch in Montana, had left everything to me in his will. The lawyer handling the estate had tracked me down through the state system, following a paper trail that led back to my mother, who had been Jacob Nelson's daughter. I stared at Dorothy, trying to process what she was telling me. I had never known I had any family left. My mother had died when I was 3, and I had no memory of her talking about her father. The state had never mentioned any relatives when they were shuffling me between foster homes. For 16 years, I had believed I was completely alone in the world. The envelope contained copies of legal documents, a death certificate, and a letter addressed to me in shaky handwriting. My hands were trembling as I opened it. The letter was short, written by a man who was clearly dying and who had spent years trying to find me. He wrote about regret, about a fight with my mother that had driven her away, about watching for news of her for decades until he finally learned that she had died and left behind a daughter. He had spent the last 5 years of his life searching for me through the system, and when he finally found me, he was too sick to make contact. The ranch, he wrote, was his apology. It was his way of trying to give me the family and the home he should have given me years ago. Dorothy explained that I could choose to stay at the facility until I turned 21, or I could leave immediately to claim my inheritance. There was no decision to make. I had been waiting my entire life for someone to want me, and even though Jacob Nelson was dead, he had left me something that proved I mattered to someone. I packed everything I owned into a single duffel bag. 19 years of life, and it all fit into one bag. Dorothy drove me to the bus station herself, which was more kindness than the state usually showed kids like me. As I climbed onto the Greyhound bus headed for Montana, I felt something I had never experienced before. It was not quite hope, but it was not despair either. It was possibility. The bus ride took 14 hours, winding through landscapes I had only seen in pictures. I pressed my face against the window and watched the world change from the gray urban sprawl I had always known to rolling hills and endless sky. With every mile, I felt like I was traveling not just to a new place, but to a new version of myself. I arrived in Cedar Falls, Montana at 6 in the morning, carrying my duffel bag and a folder full of legal documents. The town was smaller than my high school, just a main street lined with old brick buildings and pickup trucks parked at angles that suggested nobody was in much of a hurry. The air smelled like pine trees and something clean that I later learned was just the absence of car exhaust and industrial pollution. The law office of Dennis Rivera was located above the town's only diner, reached by a narrow staircase that creaked with every step. Dennis was a man in his 60s with kind eyes and calloused hands that suggested he had not always been a lawyer. He had handled Jacob Nelson's affairs for 20 years, he told me, and he had been the one who had finally tracked me down. He spread the will and property documents across his desk like a treasure map. The Double Creek Ranch was 300 acres of mountain valley, complete with a house, a barn, outbuildings, and grazing rights that stretched back 4 generations. Jacob Nelson had been a cattle rancher, though he had sold off most of his herd in his final years. The property was mine, free and clear, along with a modest bank account that would cover taxes and basic expenses for about a year. But Dennis also had bad news. Wayne Chavez, a distant cousin of Jacob Nelson's, was contesting the will. Wayne claimed that Jacob had been mentally incompetent when he wrote the will, and that the property should go to blood relatives rather than to a granddaughter who had never even met Jacob. Wayne had filed an injunction preventing me from taking possession of the property until the matter could be resolved in court. I felt my new hope crumbling. Of course there was a catch. Of course someone was going to try to take away the one thing that might finally make me feel like I belonged somewhere. But Dennis smiled and told me not to worry. Wayne's case was weak, he said, and in the meantime, the court had ruled that I could live on the property as a caretaker while the legal proceedings played out. Dennis drove me out to the ranch in his old Ford pickup, following a dirt road that wound through stands of aspen and pine. He talked about Jacob Nelson as we drove, painting a picture of a man who had been respected in the community, but who had carried a deep sadness about the daughter who had left and never come back. Jacob had been a good neighbor, Dennis said, always willing to help with a difficult calving or to lend equipment when someone needed it. When we crested the final hill and I saw the ranch spread out below us, I understood why my mother had grown up here and why Jacob Nelson had never been able to leave. The valley was like something out of a movie, with a creek running through the middle of it and mountains rising on all sides like protective walls. The house was a simple 2-story structure with a wraparound porch, painted white with green trim. The barn was red, exactly like barns were supposed to be, and there were several smaller outbuildings scattered around the property. Dennis parked in front of the house and handed me the keys. He said he would check on me in a few days, but for now, I should just settle in and get to know the place. As his truck disappeared back down the dirt road, I stood alone in front of the house that was supposed to be mine, holding keys that might not mean anything if Wayne Chavez got his way. The front door opened with a squeak that suggested it had not been used much in recent years. Inside, the house was clean, but obviously empty. Jacob Nelson had lived here alone for decades, and it showed in the careful way everything was arranged. Like a man who had plenty of time to keep things tidy. The furniture was old but well-maintained, and the walls were covered with photographs that told the story of 4 generations of Nelsons who had worked this land. I found pictures of my mother as a little girl, riding horses and helping with cattle. There were photos of her graduation from high school, and then a gap where her adult life should have been. Jacob had kept her bedroom exactly as she had left it when she was 18, complete with horse show ribbons and books about veterinary medicine. It was like a shrine to the daughter who had gotten away. In the kitchen, I found more evidence of Jacob's solitary life. The refrigerator was nearly empty, but the pantry was stocked with the kind of canned goods that could last for months. There was a coffee pot that looked like it had seen decades of use, and a kitchen table scarred by years of meals eaten alone. On the counter, I found a stack of mail that included bills, ranch supply catalogs, and letters from Dennis Rivera about the search for me. That first night, I lay in my mother's childhood bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand what had happened to my life. 24 hours ago, I had been just another aged-out foster kid with no prospects and no family. Now I was lying in a house that might be mine, surrounded by the ghosts of people who were supposed to be my family, but who I had never known existed. It was too much to process, so I just listened to the sounds of the ranch settling around me and the creek running somewhere outside in the darkness. I woke up the next morning to the sound of someone pounding on the front door. When I opened it, I found a man in his 50s with thinning hair and an expensive suit that looked out of place in the rural setting. He introduced himself as Wayne Chavez, and he was not happy to find me in the house. Wayne had driven up from Billings to see the property for himself, he said, and he was surprised that the court had allowed me to stay there during the legal proceedings. He walked through the house like he already owned it, pointing out repairs that needed to be made and talking about his plans to sell the property to developers who wanted to build vacation homes for rich people from California. I followed him around, listening to him dismiss Jacob Nelson's life work in my mother's childhood home as if it were just a commodity to be liquidated. When he started talking about tearing down the barn to make room for a golf course, I finally found my voice. I told him this was my home, that Jacob Nelson had wanted me to have it, and that I was not going anywhere. Wayne laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. He told me I was delusional if I thought some old man's guilt trip was going to hold up in court. He said I was just a foster kid with no real claim to the Nelson name, and that blood relatives had more rights than strangers, no matter what a piece of paper said. Then he got back in his BMW and drove away, leaving me standing on the porch feeling like I had been punched in the stomach. But Wayne Chavez had made a mistake. He had underestimated what this place meant to me, and he had underestimated what I was willing to fight for. I had spent my entire life being told I did not belong anywhere, being moved from place to place like an unwanted package. I was not going to let him take away the first real home I had ever had. I spent the next few days exploring every inch of the property, learning the layout of the fields and the condition of the buildings. The barn needed some work, but it was structurally sound. The fences needed mending in several places, and there were repairs needed on some of the outbuildings. But overall, the ranch was in good shape, a testament to Jacob Nelson's care and attention over the decades. In the barn, I found tools and equipment that told the story of a working ranch. There were saddles that had been oiled and maintained, hay forks with handles worn smooth by years of use, and a collection of veterinary supplies that suggested Jacob had taken good care of his animals. In one corner, I discovered a stack of journals where Jacob had recorded everything from cattle prices to weather patterns to his thoughts about the future of ranching. Reading those journals was like getting to know my grandfather through his own words. He wrote about the land with a love that was almost spiritual, describing the way the light fell across the valley at different times of day and the satisfaction of seeing healthy cattle grazing on grass his family had cultivated for generations. He also wrote about his regrets, particularly about the fight with my mother that had driven her away and his failure to find her before she died. The more I learned about Jacob Nelson, the more I understood why he had left the ranch to me. It was not just about guilt or making amends. It was about keeping the land in the family, about making sure that 4 generations of work and love would not be lost to developers who saw only dollar signs where the Nelsons had seen home. But I also realized that owning the ranch and actually running it were 2 very different things. I had grown up in cities and suburbs, moving between foster homes and group facilities. I knew nothing about cattle or horses or the dozens of skills that were required to make a ranch profitable. If I was going to keep this place, I was going to have to learn everything from scratch. I started by reading everything I could find. Jacob had a small library of books about ranching, animal husbandry, and land management. I studied them like my life depended on it, because in many ways it did. I also started reaching out to neighbors, introducing myself and asking for advice. The response was mixed. Some people, like Amy Moore, who ran the feed store in town, were welcoming and eager to help. Amy had known Jacob for 30 years, and she remembered my mother from when she was young. She told me stories about my mother's skill with horses and her dream of becoming a veterinarian. Dreams that had been cut short when she left Montana and never came back. But others were more skeptical. Alan Hughes, who owned the ranch next to mine, made it clear that he thought I was in over my head. He had heard about the legal challenge Wayne Chavez was mounting, and he seemed to think it was only a matter of time before I gave up and went back to wherever I had come from. He was polite but distant, the kind of politeness that meant he was reserving judgment until I proved I could actually do the work. I threw myself into learning everything I could about ranch life. I spent hours mending fences, repairing gates, and cleaning out the barn. My hands, which had never done more physical work than folding laundry at the youth facility, became calloused and sore. My back ached from lifting hay bales and hauling water. But every blister and every sore muscle felt like progress, like I was earning my place here one small task at a time. Ashley Long, who worked as a veterinarian for ranches throughout the valley, became my first real ally. She had known Jacob well and had tremendous respect for his knowledge of animal care. When she learned that I was Jacob's granddaughter, she offered to teach me the basics of livestock health and ranch management. Ashley was in her 30s, tough as nails, and completely unimpressed by people who thought ranching was easy or romantic. Under Ashley's guidance, I learned to read the signs of healthy and unhealthy animals, to recognize when a fence needed immediate repair versus when it could wait, and to understand the seasonal rhythms that govern ranch life. She taught me that ranching was not just about taking care of animals, but about taking care of the land itself, managing grazing patterns and water resources to ensure that the ranch could sustain itself for generations. Ashley also helped me understand the economics of ranching, which were more complicated than I had expected. Jacob had kept detailed financial records, and Ashley showed me how to read them, how to understand the relationship between feed costs and cattle prices, and how to plan for the seasonal fluctuations that could make the difference between profit and loss. But the most important thing Ashley taught me was that ranching was not something you did alone. The successful ranchers in the valley were the ones who helped each other, who shared knowledge and resources and labor when it was needed. She introduced me to other ranchers who were willing to give me advice, and slowly I began to feel like I might actually have a chance of making this work. The legal battle with Wayne Chavez, meanwhile, was heating up. Dennis Rivera kept me informed about the proceedings, explaining the various motions and counter-motions that were flying back and forth between the lawyers. Wayne was arguing that Jacob had been suffering from dementia when he wrote the will, and he had found a doctor who was willing to testify that Jacob's medical records suggested cognitive decline. Dennis was confident that Wayne's case was weak, but he warned me that court cases could be unpredictable. Wayne had money and connections, and he was clearly determined to get the ranch. The best thing I could do, Dennis said, was to prove that I was capable of running the ranch and that I was committed to staying in the community. If the judge could see that I was not just some outsider looking to cash in, it would strengthen our case significantly. So I threw myself even harder into learning ranch work. I got up before dawn to check on the few head of cattle that Jacob had left behind, making sure they had water and that the fences were secure. I spent my afternoons working on repairs and maintenance, fixing everything from loose boards in the barn to broken hinges on gates. In the evenings, I studied Jacob's journals and the ranching books, trying to absorb decades of knowledge as quickly as possible. The physical work was exhausting, but it was also satisfying in a way I had never experienced before. Every fence I mended, every gate I repaired, every improvement I made to the property felt like I was putting down roots, like I was proving that I belonged here. For the first time in my life, I was working not just for a paycheck or to satisfy someone else's requirements, but for something that was mine. As the weeks passed, I began to notice changes in how the neighbors treated me. Alan Hughes, who had been politely skeptical at first, started stopping by to check on my progress and offer advice about upcoming weather or market conditions. Amy Moore at the feed store began treating me like a regular customer rather than a curiosity, discussing feed prices and delivery schedules as if I would be around for the long term. The turning point came when a late spring storm brought heavy snow that threatened the cattle. I had been watching the weather reports and had moved the small herd to a sheltered area near the barn, but the storm was worse than predicted. The cattle needed supplemental feed, and I needed help getting it to them through the deep snow. I called Ashley, who was dealing with emergencies at several ranches, and she suggested I reach out to Alan Hughes. I was nervous about asking for help, afraid that he would see it as proof that I was not capable of handling ranch work on my own. But Ashley reminded me that asking for help when you needed it was part of being a good neighbor, not a sign of weakness. Alan responded immediately, bringing his tractor and a load of hay. We worked together for hours, breaking trails through the snow and making sure all the cattle had access to food and water. As we worked, Alan told me stories about storms he had weathered over the years and about the times when Jacob Nelson had helped him through similar emergencies. When the storm finally passed, Alan invited me into his house for coffee and a hot meal. His wife, Victoria Howard, had prepared enough food for a small army, and she insisted that I take home leftovers. As we sat around their kitchen table, I realized that this was what community felt like. It was not just about helping each other through emergencies, but about the web of relationships and mutual support that made it possible to live in a place where the nearest city was 3 hours away. That evening, as I sat in Jacob's kitchen eating Victoria's homemade stew, I felt something I had never experienced before. I felt like I was home, not just because I was living in a house that might legally be mine, but because I was part of a community that had accepted me as one of their own. But Wayne Chavez was not giving up. A few days after the storm, Dennis Rivera called with bad news. Wayne had hired a private investigator to dig into my background, and he was planning to use my history in the foster care system against me in court. Wayne's lawyer was arguing that someone with my unstable background could not be trusted to maintain a valuable property, and that the ranch would be better served by being sold to someone with proven business experience. I was furious. My time in foster care was not something to be ashamed of, but I knew that some people would see it as evidence that I was damaged goods, someone who could not be trusted with responsibility. The idea that Wayne Chavez was going to use the worst experiences of my life to steal my inheritance made me angrier than I had ever been. Dennis assured me that Wayne's strategy was likely to backfire. Judges did not like it when lawyers tried to use a person's childhood circumstances against them, especially when those circumstances were beyond the person's control. But he also warned me that the trial was going to be difficult, and that I needed to be prepared for Wayne's lawyers to ask invasive questions about my past. The trial was scheduled for late summer, which gave me a few more months to prove that I could handle ranch life. I used that time to make as many improvements to the property as possible, documenting everything with photographs and receipts to show the court that I was investing in the ranch's future rather than just living off Jacob's legacy. I also continued learning from Ashley and the other ranchers in the valley. Justin Nelson, who was not related to Jacob despite sharing the same last name, taught me about rotational grazing and how to read grass conditions to determine when cattle should be moved to fresh pasture. Angela Cooper, who ran a successful horse breeding operation, showed me how to evaluate livestock and make decisions about which animals to keep and which to sell. Every day brought new challenges and new lessons. I learned that ranching required not just physical strength and endurance, but also the ability to make quick decisions, to adapt to changing conditions, and to think several steps ahead. I learned that the weather was both your partner and your enemy, that market conditions could change overnight, and that success often depended on factors completely outside your control. But I also learned that there was a deep satisfaction in this kind of work, a sense of connection to the land and to the animals that was unlike anything I had experienced in my previous life. When I watched the cattle grazing peacefully in the early morning light, or when I saw the way the mountains changed color as the sun moved across the sky, I understood why Jacob Nelson had never been able to leave this place. As the trial date approached, I felt as ready as I could be. I had spent months proving that I could handle ranch work, and I had documentation to show that I was improving the property rather than letting it deteriorate. I had the support of neighbors who were willing to testify about my commitment to the community, and I had Dennis Rivera's confidence that the law was on my side. But I also knew that Wayne Chavez was not going to make this easy. He had money and connections, and he was clearly willing to fight dirty to get what he wanted. The trial was going to be a battle not just over the legal ownership of the ranch, but over who I was and whether I deserved to be part of the Nelson family legacy. The night before the trial, I sat on the front porch of the house, looking out over the valley that had become my home. The creek was running high from the spring snowmelt, and the cattle were settled for the night in the pasture closest to the barn. Everything was peaceful and exactly as it should be, but I knew that tomorrow could change everything. I thought about Jacob Nelson sitting on this same porch and looking out at this same view for decades. I thought about my mother who had grown up here but had left and never come back. I thought about all the foster homes I had lived in, all the places where I had never quite belonged, and how different this felt from anything I had experienced before. Whatever happened in court tomorrow, I knew that these months on the ranch had changed me. I had learned that I was stronger than I had thought, that I was capable of hard work and responsibility, and that I could be part of a community in a way I had never imagined possible. Even if Wayne Chavez succeeded in taking the ranch away from me, he could not take away what I had learned about myself and about what it meant to belong somewhere. The morning of the trial, I put on the only dress I owned and drove to the courthouse in Cedar Falls. Dennis Rivera met me on the courthouse steps, carrying a briefcase full of documents and wearing the confident expression of a lawyer who believed in his case. Ashley Long was there too, along with Alan Hughes and Victoria Howard, and several other neighbors who had come to support me. Wayne Chavez arrived in his BMW, accompanied by two lawyers in expensive suits. He looked confident, like a man who was used to getting what he wanted and who had no doubt that this would be just another successful business transaction. When he saw me surrounded by my neighbors, his expression darkened slightly, but he quickly recovered his composure. The courtroom was small and old-fashioned, with wooden benches and tall windows that let in the morning light. Judge Angela Cooper, who had been on the bench for 20 years, had a reputation for fairness and for not tolerating nonsense from lawyers who tried to turn her courtroom into a circus. Wayne's lawyer went first, painting a picture of Jacob Nelson as a lonely old man who had been manipulated into leaving his property to a stranger. He argued that I had no real connection to the Nelson family, that I had never even met Jacob, and that the will was the product of guilt and senility rather than sound judgment. He brought in the doctor who testified about Jacob's medical records, suggesting that Jacob had been suffering from cognitive decline that would have affected his decision-making ability. Then Wayne's lawyer turned his attention to me. He talked about my history in foster care as if it were evidence of criminal behavior, suggesting that someone who had been rejected by multiple families could not be trusted with a valuable property. He painted a picture of me as an opportunist who had swooped in to take advantage of an old man's guilt, someone who would probably sell the ranch to the highest bidder as soon as the legal proceedings were over. It was humiliating to sit there and listen to my entire life being twisted into evidence against me. But Dennis had prepared me for this, and I tried to stay calm and focused on the fact that Wayne's lawyer was making arguments that had nothing to do with the law or with Jacob's clearly stated wishes. When it was our turn, Dennis methodically dismantled Wayne's case. He presented evidence that Jacob had been mentally sharp right up until his death, including testimony from Ashley Long and other people who had interacted with Jacob regularly. He showed that Jacob had spent years searching for me and had worked with Dennis to craft a will that would ensure the ranch stayed in the family rather than being sold to developers. Dennis also presented evidence of the improvements I had made to the property, the relationships I had built with neighbors, and my commitment to learning ranch management. Ashley testified about my dedication to learning proper animal care, and Alan Hughes talked about how I had handled the spring storm and other challenges that had tested my ability to manage the property. But the most powerful moment came when Dennis read aloud from Jacob's journals, particularly the entries where Jacob wrote about his regret over losing his daughter and his determination to make sure that his granddaughter would have the home and the family that he had failed to provide for my mother. Jacob's own words, written in his careful handwriting over a period of years, made it clear that the will was not the product of senility or manipulation, but of careful thought and deep love. When Dennis finished presenting our case, Judge Cooper called for a recess. I spent the break outside the courthouse with my supporters, trying not to think about what would happen if we lost. Ashley reminded me that regardless of the outcome, I had proven to myself and to the community that I was capable of ranch work and that I belonged in the valley. But I knew that losing the ranch would mean losing not just a piece of property, but the first real home I had ever had. When court reconvened, Judge Cooper delivered her ruling. She had clearly been thinking carefully about the case during the recess, and she spoke slowly and deliberately as she explained her reasoning. She found that Jacob Nelson had been mentally competent when he wrote his will, and that his decision to leave the ranch to me was legally valid and clearly intentional. More importantly, she found that Wayne Chavez's challenge was motivated not by legitimate concern for Jacob's wishes, but by greed and a desire to profit from the sale of family property. She noted that Wayne had never shown any interest in the ranch while Jacob was alive, and that his plans to sell the property to developers were exactly the opposite of what Jacob would have wanted. Judge Cooper also commented on the evidence of my commitment to the ranch and to the community, noting that I had invested time, money, and effort into improving the property and learning the skills necessary to manage it successfully. She said that the court was impressed by the support I had received from neighbors and by my obvious dedication to honoring Jacob's legacy. The ruling was final. The ranch was mine, free and clear, and Wayne Chavez's challenge was dismissed with prejudice, meaning he could not file another challenge based on the same arguments. As Judge Cooper's words sank in, I felt a wave of relief and joy that was almost overwhelming. I had won. The ranch was really, truly mine. Wayne Chavez stormed out of the courtroom without a word, his lawyers trailing behind him. But I was surrounded by my neighbors, who were congratulating me and talking about plans for the future. Ashley was already discussing the cattle operation we could build together, and Alan was offering to help me with the fall roundup. That evening, the community threw an impromptu celebration at Amy Moore's house. It seemed like half the valley was there, bringing food and stories and advice for the future. For the first time in my life, I was part of a celebration that was actually about me, about my success and my place in the community. As I looked around at the faces of people who had become my friends and neighbors, I realized that winning the legal battle was only part of what had happened over the past few months. I had found something more valuable than property or money. I had found a place where I belonged, a community that had accepted me not because of who my family was, but because of who I had proven myself to be. That was 3 years ago. Today, the Double Creek Ranch is a thriving operation with a small but profitable cattle herd and a growing reputation for quality beef. I have expanded the operation gradually, learning as I go and building on the foundation that Jacob Nelson created over decades of careful work. Ashley Long and I have become business partners as well as friends, combining her veterinary expertise with my growing knowledge of ranch management. We have implemented rotational grazing practices that have improved the health of the grassland, and we have invested in genetic improvements to the cattle herd that have increased both the quality and the profitability of our beef. Alan Hughes and Victoria Howard have become like family to me, the kind of family I never had growing up, but always dreamed of having. They have taught me not just about ranching, but about what it means to be part of a community, to have people you can count on and people who count on you in return. I still think about my mother sometimes, wondering what her life would have been like if she had stayed here instead of leaving. I think about Jacob Nelson, and I wish I could have met him and thanked him for giving me not just a ranch, but a chance to discover who I really am. I think about all the foster homes I lived in, all the places where I never quite fit, and I am grateful for those experiences too, because they taught me to recognize real belonging when I finally found it. The ranch house is no longer the lonely place it was when Jacob lived here alone. I have filled it with friends and neighbors, with the sounds of laughter and conversation that echo off the walls where my mother once played as a child. I have kept her room as a kind of memorial, but the rest of the house has become truly mine, filled with my own memories and my own dreams for the future. I have learned that family is not just about blood relationships or legal documents. Family is about the people who show up when you need help, who celebrate your successes and support you through your failures, who accept you as you are and help you become who you are meant to be. I have found that kind of family here in this valley, among people who have taught me that belonging is not something you are born into, but something you earn through dedication and hard work and genuine care for others. The Double Creek Ranch will always be Jacob Nelson's legacy, but it is also becoming my own. I am building something here that will last, something that future generations of my chosen family will be able to build upon. I am creating the kind of home and community that I never had as a child, but that I can now provide for others who might need a place to belong. If you have ever felt like you do not belong anywhere, if you have ever wondered whether you will ever find your place in the world, I want you to know that it is possible. It might not happen the way you expect, and it might not look like what you imagine, but there is a place for you somewhere, and there are people who will welcome you if you are willing to do the work to earn your place among them. I hope my story inspires you to keep looking for your own place of belonging, to keep working toward the life you want to build, and to never give up on the possibility that your best days are still ahead of you. Please subscribe if this story touched you and share your own experiences with finding home and family in the comments below. I would love to hear from you and to know that this story has made a difference in your life. Sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you are born into, and sometimes home is not a place you come from, but a place you create through love and hard work and the willingness to put down roots where you are planted.